Hey there, Margie Bryce here, bringing you the Crabby Pastor podcast. And I don't think you're going to be too surprised to know that it's too easy today to become the Crabby Pastor. Our time together will give you food for thought to help you be the ministry leader fully surrendered to God's purposes and living into whatever it takes to get you there and keep you there. So we're talking about sustainability in ministry. Well, I am here today with Janyne McConaughey. She is the author of Trauma in the Pews, and the subtitle is The Impact on Faith and Spiritual Practices. And I think when I first saw the book, I wasn't sure exactly what to make of that. But I picked up a copy and I have been very intrigued with it. Just, trauma is kind of a buzzword a lot today, but Janyne is going to tell us a bit about the book in general and give us an idea of who you are, a little bit of introduction to the book, Janyne.
Great. Thank you. And I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And it was a book that I never intended to write because I was an educator and I taught in ministry preparation colleges. And so I was involved in the ministry preparation for teachers and for ministry church work for over 30 years. And so that was the world that I lived in, was ministry preparation. And then I retired at the age of 60 because I had childhood trauma surface. And it brought me to the point where I retired at 62, which I never intended to do either. I always figured that I would continue teaching because I love teaching and I love students, but I wasn't able. And I went through a 3-year intensive healing process with the use of EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, to heal from extensive abuse, including sexual abuse from the age of 3, and it continued until 23 in all different circumstances. And once a child becomes vulnerable, then they're vulnerable, including as a young adult. And so as I healed that, I began to realize that for the most part, what I had believed were spiritual problems, because I'm teaching in Bible colleges and I can't figure out why I struggle to do the things that I teach, right? And so as I published 3 memoirs, and people started contacting me and saying, "Oh, thank you for talking about this." And and they always would end with, "I just always feel like a spiritual failure." And I went, wait a minute, this conversation, my books weren't even about spirituality. They were about childhood trauma. And I realized that the people who had experienced adversity in childhood often felt like spiritual failures. So that led to Trauma in the Pews, which is what we're going to talk about today. It's kind of a long story to get there to make that make sense.
No, it's good. It's good.
And so what I realized, at first, the book was written to survivors because I wanted them to understand that their struggles were not spiritual. This is not a spiritual problem. This is what trauma is. This is what the impact of trauma is. And I probably need to define that in a minute. And
yeah. But then trauma does impact your spirituality.
Yes, it absolutely does. But the answer is not to become more spiritual. The answer,
read your Bible more, pray more.
Yes. And so that's why I wrote this to survivors, and my publisher at that point said, really, this needs to be in the hands of people who are in ministry. They need to understand the people in the pews who are suffering and that actually are being re-traumatized because trauma is not understood by ministry leaders. And so that's where Trauma in the Pews came from.
Okay.
And so I'm in the process of writing what I really intended to write in the first place, but it'll be a better version now, than is Trauma in the Pews 2.0, Healing as a Spiritual Practice.
Okay.
And so we don't need to separate the two, but we need to understand that healing trauma is a physical, embodied, and neuroscientific, embedded in a person, and the spiritual answers of try harder are not effective for them. So
Right.
that's where this book came from.
So I'm curious about what you said, that ministry leaders can inadvertently re-traumatize people who have experienced, and are we talking about just people who have experienced childhood trauma on some level? Let's rewind for a second.
Okay.
And let me let you define trauma for us.
Okay. So the definition of trauma is an actual, if you look at a clinical definition of it, an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. That's a traumatic event. But it is trauma is any situation. I kind of expand on it and say any situation which causes an individual to feel threatened physically or emotionally. And if you think about childhood trauma, it's very easy for a child to feel threatened. A lot of times the child will be terrified, the adults in the room are fine, right?
Right.
What emotionally feel powerless and or overwhelms the capacity to cope. And it is a nervous system issue where the nervous system is overwhelmed. Your brain functions go offline. You can't think. You are flooded with stress hormones. It is a physical impact of an event. And the key is that it results in lasting adverse effects on well-being and the ability to function
as an adult. Then
as an adult. And so, and when the functioning ends out to be, for instance, early childhood trauma will impact the brain. The brain, it develops differently when there's toxic stress or trauma. And so as an adult, your brain does not function like it would have if you'd been in a nurturing environment.
Sure. And I'll toss in just a personal kind of picture how it can happen. It can happen. Somebody could sexually abuse you. Some other kind of abuse could happen that way, but it also could happen just incidentally. Because I remember as a child, and I had to be about 4 or 5. I'm trying to think. My parents had to go home and tend to my younger sister, so I had to be 5, maybe 5.5, 6, somewhere in there, 5, 6. I'm in the hospital. I was sick. They had me on IVs, and I could hear my parents talking over the bed that I was in and saying, they had to tend to my sisters and what all was going on. And I looked like I was sleeping, but I could hear everything they were saying. So I don't know if I was in like a twilight sleep, what kind of, situation that would be. And they decided that since I was sleeping, they were going to leave. And I was scared out of my mind. And I was hollering, don't leave me, don't leave me, don't leave me. But I couldn't move at all. So, you take something like that where really nobody intended anything harmful. Yeah. However, as an adult, I can get pretty easily jangled by something abandonment related, where I feel like I'm being abandoned or left out or left or something. And I have to say, oh, gee, it's that again.
Right. Right. I've spent the last 10 years of my life saying, oh, gee, it's that. It's that again. And
so that is how a trauma can, continue in your adult life even.
And without self-reflection and self-awareness, and really, a lot of times when those things happen, we distance ourselves from it. And children, and you may not even remember it. Like one of my incidents, I generally just remembered a piece of it. It's just a flash. And I had to become curious about those flashes and say, oh, I'm in a room. It's a green room. I'm on a crinkly bed. I'm crying. I have my pet, my little stuffed dog, and I'm alone. And that ended out to be a hospital. While you're telling your story, I'm like, oh, yes, I had a similar experience where my dad went off to take care of my mom and I was left in the room. And so and children, we used to say children are resilient, well, there's a lot to resilience, and there's sometimes they just get up and do what they have to do. And without having an adult who will talk through things with them and explain to them, I'm sorry that I had to leave the room. I know you were frightened. You had every reason to be frightened, but I want you to know that I will come back. And that kind of conversation, when those things don't happen, that's when that gets stuck inside of us and carries on. And then it affects everything we do in our lives, right?
Right. And so you've defined trauma for us, and your book is then to help ministry leaders understand what is wrong with these people. That's kind of a weird way to put it, but it talks about how some people seem to connect more easily and more deeply and more genuinely with faith and faith practices, and then there's this other group that seem to struggle.
Right. And so I'm a Wesleyan, and John Wesley, he saw those people, like his groups that he had, they benefited the majority of people. They were a great benefit to, but then he said, there's other people that are just resistant. It just doesn't seem to do them. It doesn't catch. It doesn't. And so he created separate groups for them. And a lot of our recovery ministry, that kind of comes out of that. But he didn't understand anything about trauma, so he didn't know what he was looking at. But what he was looking at were the most highly traumatized people who were unable to benefit from what everyone else seemed to be able to benefit from. And so, I tell a story about two men, and one came from this background, and another came from a nurturing background, and one came from a highly dysfunctional home with an alcoholic father. And when they sit in the church service, when they listen to a sermon, they're going to hear that totally differently. Right. When the boy whose father told him how worthless he was every day, when we talk about sin and how we're not worthy, and sing songs about, not then for the person who's been highly traumatized and already believes they're not worthless, what they need to do is believe that they're worth it.
So they already believe that they're worthless, but they need to know that they are worthy of God's love.
They are worthy, right? Yeah. And so it's and so what I tried to do in the book was to help them get inside a survivor, and what the narratives, what the things that we believe we're saying that are helpful. In other words, to understand that we've sinned, but the problem is that the survivor a lot of times blames themselves for what wasn't their fault because of shame. And so,
right.
There's a lot in the book.
I know. I was like, okay, you said in the book, shame is the limiter and destroyer of hope and freedom. And I thought, well, that's huge, because shame, and you say in the book, foundationally is embarrassment.
Right. It's a perversion of embarrassment. Is what to be embarrassed is one thing. So you can do something. I mean, I am constantly doing something. It's like, oh, that was embarrassing, right? And I can move on. But before my healing journey, if I did something, then I would be like, that's just because I'm unworthy. All of that. So shame tells you that there is something fundamentally wrong with you that makes it impossible for others to love you, and makes it impossible for God to love you. It's fundamentally, there's something wrong with you, instead of, oh, I did something really super quirky. Okay, or I said something that was awkward, and then you're embarrassed for a moment. No. And for me, that would just dissolve me into this horrible shame spiral. And so the great freedom for me is to not have those layers of shame anymore, to be able to be embarrassed and not have it just send me into a spiral. Yeah.
Right. And so then you're dealing with people in your pews, the people that that God has placed your feet over which to serve them. Place your feet right there in front of these, and here's where these are the people, these are the sheep that you have. And what percentage of people in any given congregation might have experienced trauma?
The statistic. Okay, so we have to talk about ACEs, so the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which took place in the 1990s. What it did, it was a study done by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, and what it did was to interview people with their medical history and ask them 10 questions. Did this happen to you before you were 19 years of age? And each one of those that they said yes to was an adverse childhood experience. And the more that they had of those, then the greater the propensity, not determination, but the greater propensity that they would suffer health issues and mental health issues. Okay. So I have to give that to say 65% of the population, that particular population, which was educated for the most part. They all were working for Kaiser Permanente. They were not, and for the most part, white. Okay. So that's an interesting element to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and 65% of them had at least one ACE. And so those of us who work in this field, we understand that it doesn't fully cover what trauma is doing, doesn't fully. So I kind of say there probably are 85% at least that have had at least one ACE in your comment. But honestly, everyone, because we all lived through a pandemic and it was a collective trauma, and it made us feel helpless and powerless, and we didn't know which way to turn. Our whole world turned upside down. And so people who have experienced trauma, they come to church for help. So we just are like, you know what, just about 100% of the people, and it's really high among ministry leaders. I mean, the research on that, which I can make available, the research on that says that those who go into ministry tend to also have a high number of adverse childhood experiences. And so because they're wanting to help other people, because
sure. And they found help through Christ. But I just want to slip this in here. I'm going to put a copy of the ACE, I don't know what survey, I guess it is.
Yes.
The 10 questions. And as you go down and read those, there are things in there like someone in your family was alcoholic. It talks about, were you ever at the place where you were wearing dirty clothes as a little kid, and somebody's not doing their job and caring for you. Or it talks about violence in the home between the parents or between parent versus child. And so I think when you go down that list, you'll kind of see and think about people in your congregations who have experienced these things. And now as adults, they are sitting right there in your pews for you to minister to. So now I want to go to the piece about how ministry leaders can inadvertently re-traumatize.
So there's an interesting discussion that's been going on this week on Facebook about the story of David and Bathsheba.
Oh.
And the traditional story of that, which I heard all the time. And my dad had nothing to do with, he was the one who saved me. My mother was incapable of being the mother that she needed to be. And neglect and emotional distance is also a form of trauma where your needs are not met. So we need to say that. But anyway, my dad never, but when I got into more fundamentalist circles, like Bathsheba was always portrayed as the loose woman who was flaunting her body, and that David fell into sin and that isn't even what happened. Right.
And he was supposed to go off. He was supposed to be at war.
Yes.
And he chose to stay home.
He chose to stay home while he sent other people out to die. And then he is like looking over at through people's windows and things and sees, and he summons her, and she has no choice. He's the king. There is absolutely, in that day, she would have not had any choice whatsoever. He was, and so anyway, but that story, as a survivor who blame myself for the abuse that occurred to me, if that is not preached in the correct way, then I am re-traumatized every time I hear that sermon preached, with Bathsheba being the loose woman who brought David down, right? And so when you 25% of of women in a congregation have been sexually abused, it's probably higher. But it's not just they have the statistic lower for men, but I don't. In my work that I do, I don't think that's true. I think it's probably equal for men. They just don't talk about it. And they have a much more difficult time talking about their experiences. And going for help is really difficult for men to go for help. When a man goes to therapy to help for his childhood sexual abuse, it's huge. They're like rock stars to me. So anyway, when we don't understand the impact, when we don't understand from a survivor's perspective, then we're very likely, for instance, sin. Okay, what is sin? I talk about that a lot in the book, about we need to nuance it, because there are many choices that survivors make that are survival choices. They learn how to survive as a small child. Okay, let's just take manipulation as one of those. Okay, I hate the word, but let's take it.
Okay.
So a child whose parents are not taking care of them, not meeting their needs, and they are powerless. They can't drive a car. They can't go to the store and buy food. They can't. And so they are dependent on the adult to have their needs met. But if they ask for anything, they are going to be shamed and possibly abused and hurt. So they become very, very clever at getting what they need without necessarily asking for it. And that is manipulation. And so we will look out and we'll say that person is so manipulative. What we need to say is, what was their childhood like that makes them think that manipulation is the only way to get what they need?
That's a big thing for people to do, to not look intently at the situation and what's going on, but to take the view from several thousand feet up and say a big picture question like that, like what is causing that person to do that thing that way.
Right. And part of, a lot of I have a friend who just published a book on parenthood from a biblical perspective, and he does a great job. It's cultivating kids, but he does a great job talking about how the predominant view of children has been that because they're born with a sin nature, that they're manipulative from the get-go, that their crying is their crying is the only way they have to communicate their needs. They're hungry, they're tired, they're whatever it is, the only voice they have is to cry. And when the adults feel like they're being manipulated by a child crying instead of trying to figure out what the child needs. But that begins with very small children, where we look at things as manipulative instead of like I always thought of myself as a very needy person. No, I was a child with needs.
Right.
There's a great difference between being needy, which is judgmental, and a child. So when a sermon is being preached, like you have to get out there and, instead of pounding people on the head for not, for being manipulative or wanting their own way, right? That's what you don't want. God's way. You want to do things your way. Well, when someone has never known anything other than having to fight for their own needs and to have them safe taken care of. It's very easy to view them that way, but that's so harmful to them because they need compassion and they need to be shown that it's possible to have a voice.
How could you reframe that? How could you reframe that for somebody who has been traumatized?
I think that and here's one of the problems, and I said this in a podcast last week, is that we need to understand trauma very deeply, which I do a very deep dive into the inner workings of trauma in the book, because if it's the only book I needed to say it in it. But I think that when you in the trauma movement, we say when you see trauma, you can never unsee it. Right. And when I teach a class at Tabor College in their graduate program, master's in education in neuroscience and trauma, and we go through the book, What Happened to You, which is the reverse of what's wrong with you. Okay. And as the students, it's kind of the first class that they take where we dive into how trauma impacts your behaviors as an adult or a child. And as they begin to as they see trauma, I watch them turn from judgment to compassion.
Okay.
And so, but it takes a deep, intense study of it to all of a sudden be like, oh my gosh, this is not what I'm seeing here is the impact of trauma on this person's life. I really believe it's how we learn to see people through Jesus' eyes. And I, on my journey of healing and understanding and looking deep within myself and understanding trauma and how my love for people, like every once in a while, that old voice of judgment comes in, they're, if they tried hard enough, they could do it. But no, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I wonder why they can't do this. I wonder why this is so difficult for them. And I see that kind of compassion in every interaction Jesus had with anyone. And so one of the reasons I do what I do is because I believe that understanding trauma has the power to make us more compassionate in our ministries for the people who are the most wounded among us. And let me just say, if I listen to stories constantly, and the people who still desire to have a spiritual experience and a relationship with God, and when I understand their story, I'm like, what? I mean, my story is like that. Like, why am I even doing this? It doesn't, if you knew my whole story, it doesn't even make sense. And it's because I believe that healing enables us to have the abundant life that Jesus always intended for us.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I'm going to stop us here for today, but where I want to go in our next podcast together is to talk a bit about trauma in the ministry leaders, because that is an important. How can you be very broken and then serve the very broken? But as you brought up near the end here of our discussion, healing needs to take place. Hey friends, the Krabby Pastor podcast is sponsored by Bryce Art Glass, and you can find that on Facebook. I make stained glass, that's part of my self-care. And also by Bryce Coaching, where I coach ministry leaders and business leaders. And so the funds that I generate from coaching and from making stained glass is what is supporting this podcast. And I will have opportunities for you to be a part of sponsoring me. And as always, you can do the buy me a cup of coffee thing in the show notes. But I will have some other ways that you can be a part of getting the word out about the importance of healthy self-care for ministry leaders. Hey, thanks for listening. It is my deep desire and passion to champion issues of sustainability in ministry and for your life. So I'm here to help. I stepped back from pastoral ministry, and I feel called to help ministry leaders create and cultivate sustainability in their lives so that they can go the distance with God and whatever plans that God has for you. I would love to help. I would consider it an honor. And in all things, make sure you connect to these sustainability practices, so that you don't become the crabby pastor.